Hi, everyone. As Holly said, I'm Keegan Walden, and I'm going to give a talk on creating a feedback culture. I'm also the co-founder and COO of Torch, which, as Holly mentioned, is a leadership development tech company that builds more effective leaders with human coaches and leadership development software. I'm a psychologist by training, and I've worked with high-level leaders in a one-on-one capacity to facilitate change. And I also approach leadership from a psychometric perspective. Psychometrics is the branch of psychology that deals with measurement. And at Torch, we're focused on developing leadership in a meaningful way. And in order to do that, you have to define the aspects of leadership that you think really matter and measure them over time so you can build your clients' awareness of their strengths and challenges. So today we're going to be talking about hard feedback. That's feedback that's difficult to deliver, typically because it's negative. So managers don't want to give hard feedback to a direct report because they don't want to be perceived as overly harsh or unfair. And the direct report typically doesn't want to be perceived as incompetent, which makes perfect sense. Yet it's really important to give and receive hard feedback because that's a big part of how we grow. This is a great comic that illustrates the frustration of hard feedback. So it's a manager and an employee and sitting opposite one another in a workplace, and the manager says, "Your work output leaves a lot to be desired." And the employee says, "In what way specifically?" The manager says, it's hard to say really. Generally, I would give it a thumbs down or a frowning face." And the employee says, "Your feedback is an emoticon?" So in this example, the giver has not defined the problem. And the receiver has, as a result, no idea what he needs to do to change to create a solution. So this is a situation I think we've all found ourselves in at some point in our career, whether we were the giver or the receiver or both. Negative feedback is really hard to give well, and often when it's not done well, it just leads to more trouble and more problems along the way. Okay, today we're going to talk about creating a healthy feedback culture, and we'll define what that means, the importance of encouraging hard feedback from both a manager to a direct report and vice versa. And the vice versa part is not something that gets a lot of attention, but is really important both for the development of the manager and of the direct report. We'll talk about how to successfully deliver hard feedback, and by successfully, I mean maximizing the chances that the receiver of the feedback can act on it. And then finally, we'll talk about the importance of leading by example, which gets back to the idea that for managers to be credible, they need to be able to both give and receive negative feedback to colleagues, both above and below them in social power within the organization. Okay, let's talk about feedback. What is a healthy feedback culture? Here's a definition that I like. It's a culture in which every team member feels comfortable giving constructive, positive, or negative feedback to any other team member without fear of retaliation. Now, retaliation, I mean retaliation broadly speaking. That could be as subtle as not being liked as much as you were before you gave the hard feedback, or could be more overt through criticism or some kind of direct, more tense interaction. And this kind of culture sounds easy enough to implement, but we find that less than 10% of the companies we work with actually have a healthy feedback culture. Instead, what we find 90% of the time is one of three different varieties of unhealthy feedback cultures. So we find yes feedback cultures. That's a culture in which the team only feels comfortable giving positive feedback. There really isn't any negative feedback that's given. It exists, but it typically remains in the minds of the people who would otherwise give it. And instead, because there isn't, the environment doesn't support it, only positive feedback is given. We also find what we call zero feedback cultures. This is a culture in which there's really no feedback of any kind, at least none that's given directly. And instead, all the team members, there's an idea that the team members should just kind of know what they need to work on based on feedback that was given a long time ago or was given implicitly through innuendo, or has really just remained in the minds of the people who need to give it, but they sort of feel like they've given it. Lastly, we occasionally find cultures of weaponized feedback. And those are cultures in which conflict is typically avoided, yet there is negative feedback that needs to be given, and eventually things boil over in the form of unconstructive negative feedback. So healthy feedback really requires trust. both from the person giving the feedback and from the person receiving the feedback. So the giver needs to be able to trust that the receiver will listen and be open and curious about the feedback and will not react defensively, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about what I mean by defensively. And will at least consider changing their behavior. So the person giving the feedback needs to see that that feedback is going to land with the receiver, and they're going to really think about changing their behavior in some way to address the feedback. Even if they don't actually do it, just the fact that the giver can see the receiver really giving that thought is very important. Now, the receiver needs to be able to trust that the giver has the receiver's best interest at heart and only wants to help. So even though they're giving them very difficult information and difficult feedback to take in, they're doing so from a place of wanting to help and wanting to help the person grow. And that's really where the trust takes hold and can grow over time if the receiver can trust that this is the case. And the receiver also needs to be able to trust that the giver has a valuable and useful perspective. So even if they don't agree, even if the receiver doesn't agree with that perspective, they have to be able to see some value and utility in that perspective. And again, that comes from their need to be able to trust that the giver is insightful enough to be able to have a useful perspective, even if there's some disagreement there. So these are the four basic requirements of trust when you cross a giver and a receiver and you combine them. So our research suggests that the trust needed for quality feedback is low in companies generally across sector. But there's actually an even bigger problem. And that's what I call the generosity gap, which is the tendency to be more generous in evaluating ourselves than we are in evaluating others. The generosity gap includes trust, but also has several other important dimensions. And we've measured it directly by asking many leaders at many different companies to rate how much they agree with the following statements. So on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree, we asked them to rate the statements, my coworkers can trust me, versus I can trust my coworkers. That looks at the generosity gap in terms of trust. I am good at giving feedback to others, versus my coworkers are good at giving feedback to me, looking at the generosity gap in terms of feedback. I am good at managing conflict, versus I work with people who are good at managing conflict. That looks at the generosity gap in terms of conflict. I am good at owning my mistakes and initiating repair, versus others at my company are good at owning mistakes and initiating repair. So here you can see across a few different domains, we're asking people to evaluate themselves versus, generally speaking, their coworkers. And what we found is a substantial and statistically significant generosity gap in terms of trust, feedback, conflict, and repair. So here are the data. Whether we're talking about trust and establishing trusting relationships, giving and receiving feedback, managing conflict, or really taking responsibility for mistakes and initiating repair, we find that within every group we've looked at, individuals tend to think that they're more developed than every other individual, which is of course impossible. It creates a kind of paradox. So you create a healthy feedback culture by closing the generosity gap, and that starts at the individual level. It's more common to say that change starts at the top with the CEO and the C-suite, and there's truth to that because the C-suite does model the behavior that others look to. But the generosity gap is so pervasive that every person in an organization really needs to look at how their belief that they're superior to their colleagues in whatever way is creating separation or poor lines of communication or an us versus them mentality, or the belief that you're a loner within the organization whose talent nobody recognizes. Whatever the case may be, each person has to be accountable for their contribution to an unhealthy feedback culture. Okay, so let me pause there and ask the folks who are on the call to use the chat box to share examples of situations that they think call for this kind of feedback. Just curious what you guys are coming across in your day-to-day lives.
All right, Keegan, let's go ahead and see what folks have to say. And just as a reminder, you can put your input for Keegan there in the chat box, and then we'll go ahead and discuss just as soon as we have some content here. Keegan, while we're waiting on a page refresh, what do you predict people might say? What are you hearing most?
So what I often hear is negative feedback is really called for when a manager observes a negative performance in some workplace domain. Potentially a manager observing a bad interaction between two of their team members and wanting to comment on that. An individual contributor feels like their manager undermined them in a team meeting. And yes, we can and should also give hard feedback upwards, which is important. Those are all common examples. And it could be that, as we're just getting going, people are still settling in. So we can move on and come back later to more comments from the audience. But it's important to think about, as a leader, and I really think that everyone in an organization as a leader at some level, how is it that I need to give negative feedback? And I think of a time when I needed to do that, and maybe I, for whatever reason, due to lack of skill or just not being sure exactly how to do it, when did I not do that when I should have? And then what did that cost me? What kinds of challenges did that present down the road? Because often we find that when negative feedback isn't given in a good way, it causes more problems than it solves, even though in the moment it's easier to avoid. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so what is hard feedback? Here's a kind of pithy definition that comes from the research. It's information that flows between people that has to do with their interaction in the here and now. It can be heard by the receiver versus the receiver just denying it and getting defensive. When we talk about defenses, when I say heard, I mean it can really be taken in by the receiver and processed so that they can and really think about it and think about how they could adjust their behavior or how they want to respond in a way that's not defensive. Hard feedback, when done well, also keeps the relationship intact and open and healthy. And in fact, that's hard to do. People tend to fear or to be anxious about the fact that if they give hard feedback, it's going to cause a rupture or a tear that's going to be hard to repair. And it's going to cause a relationship that was fine to become strained. And actually, if done well, the opposite should happen. The relationship should become more close, should become more authentic. And it validates the feedback process in future interactions. So by giving hard feedback well, it makes the act of giving feedback something that becomes possible to do better in the future. And people don't have such strong fears about having to do it. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the value of hard feedback. If you get this right, it can transform your relationships. It can transform your relationships with direct reports, because they will come to understand that if there's some way in which their work is not optimal, they're going to get feedback on that, so they get the opportunity to grow. They also get practice hearing difficult feedback, which they have to assimilate in order to make a change. And they'll come to trust you as a valuable source of guidance. It can also transform your culture when you have many managers all giving difficult feedback in an effective way to direct reports who also feel empowered to give negative feedback to their managers. It can just create a much more open, much more trusting environment. And by extension, you can have less turnover among your employees and greater engagement and morale. It can also help you transform your own leadership and potential. So to the extent that, and I think all of us do to a large extent, aspire to grow as leaders and to become more robust in our ability to organize our teams toward a common goal, learning to give hard feedback well is really aligned with that. So it's a really important thing to learn to do well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the consequences of not giving hard feedback. So never giving hard feedback can lead to a toxic work environment. So without it, that toxic environment can really take hold, and that's probably the worst outcome. So yes feedback cultures and zero feedback cultures and weaponized feedback cultures can all lead to toxicity. So in a yes feedback culture, that leads to that sounds like it might not lead to a toxic work environment. It's counterintuitive to think that giving a lot of positive feedback would lead to a negative environment. But even so, in yes feedback cultures, people have negative feedback in their minds. They're just not delivering it, and there isn't trust that it'll be well received. So it creates a culture in which the team members feel like they have to walk on eggshells, because if they give any negative feedback, there'll be a big blow up or it just won't be well received. Now, in zero feedback cultures, where there really isn't any feedback of any kind being given, there tends to be this gnawing sense that things aren't right, but no one is talking about it. So there's an elephant in the room, but no one feels safe enough to acknowledge it. And that's not a comfortable work environment, too. That's in some sense toxic. Now, clearly, in weaponized feedback cultures, where there's open conflict or feedback is used to demean or diminish or is exercised through open conflict, that's also clearly toxic, right? So the alternatives to having a healthy feedback culture, all in some way, each in their own way, contribute to a toxic work environment. So not giving hard feedback can also lead to unaddressed bad behavior, because in a feedback-free environment, there really tend to be a lack of consequences and a lack of accountability. And without those consequences or that accountability, it's bad behavior can run amok, right? Because the people who are behaving badly don't know that they're not going to be called out on it. And here there's I think a little bit of a link to be drawn between managing and also parenting, where you have to hold your child accountable and provide accountability for their behavior when it's less than what you would like. I have a 5-year-old daughter named Delphine. She really loves the fruit-flavored probiotics that we keep in the fridge. And if I'm not holding good boundaries with her, she'll go into the fridge and eat probiotic after probiotic after probiotic. And she can actually get an upset stomach, ironically, from eating too many of them. And so I really need to not give her hard feedback, but provide accountability in order to rein in that difficult behavior. Now, of course, workplaces are made up of adults, right? They're not 5-year-olds. They're all grown adults. But even adults will have a tendency to naturally push against the boundaries until they find a limit. And by that I mean boundaries broadly speaking. So boundaries about deadlines, boundaries about the beginning and ends of meetings, boundaries about vacation. There need to be clearly established boundaries, and giving negative feedback is a good way to hold those boundaries. So not giving hard feedback can also lead to the delivery of inferior work. So in an environment where the difficult feedback is not given, the team member may not know that their work is inferior. And that's a real injustice to the person who should get hard feedback, but isn't, because they're really deprived of an opportunity to grow. Not giving hard feedback can also lead to poor resource allocation. So the team is underperforming, but they don't get the feedback they need to do better. They might need more resources or need to be reorganized in some way, but that's unlikely to happen unless the problem is identified and dealt with. And that necessarily involves giving some kind of difficult feedback at various points along the line. Let's talk a little bit about what bad feedback can look like. So one category or one dimension of bad feedback is that it tends to be too general or too vague. So example of vague feedback would be, things aren't going well, I'm not sure this is a good fit for you, I need you to do a better job on your presentations. Those statements each identify potentially perhaps a kind of problem, but it's not even identifying the problem in a crisp way that provides actionable information. So it's far too general. So vague feedback is inflammatory without giving the recipient the information they need to grow. Hard feedback can also come too late. So because hard feedback is difficult to give, managers can tend to wait too long and let a problem escalate too much and let the tensions kind of fester, at which point the problem is really big and it becomes much harder to deal with. So timeliness is an important quality in giving hard feedback. Bad feedback can also be offensive. So typically what happens is, frustration and resentment accumulate, and that can result, if there's too much of it accumulating, in character attacks, which makes the challenging feedback much harder to repair, makes the tensions harder to repair. So if I have a direct report and they're not doing what I need them to do, and I'm getting frustrated, but also not saying anything, eventually that frustration is going to spill over in some way, right? And I might make a comment that I wish I hadn't said. And then in addition to dealing with the original issue, which was their performance in some way, I also have to repair the fact that I said something that I really regretted. That also makes the giver and the receiver less likely to engage in the future in a constructive feedback exchange, because they've both had a negative experience that they're motivated to avoid. So why do managers struggle to give hard feedback? Well, we've all had experiences with bad feedback from a manager or peer or direct report in the past. And those experiences were typically so uncomfortable that we just don't want to experience that again. It's natural. It's perfectly understandable. Another factor here is that in the Western world, in American culture, we have relatively little access to healthy models of conflict. We might not have gotten a healthy model of conflict in our family of origin. We tend not to get them from most sources of media, reality TV being an obvious example. It's typically not taught in school or college or high school. Then in the workforce, there's very little training on how to do this well. And if there is training, it's so sporadic that those practices don't really take hold, with some exceptions, obviously. So many studies have shown that strong bonds of trust in an organization lead to retention, higher satisfaction, and higher productivity, among a variety of other benefits. And having a trusted relationship with your coworkers is the key ingredient if you want to have successful hard feedback relationships. Building trust takes time, but the good news is that giving hard feedback, although it may seem counterintuitive, is one of the core ingredients to creating a trusting, caring relationship with coworkers. So that sounds like a paradox, but trust makes it easier for you to have a productive, critical conversation with someone. But at the same time, getting into the habit of giving hard feedback will continue to grow trust between you and your direct reports. So this actually builds on itself. For example, at Torch, we've learned that the biggest leadership growth happens once there's a trusted relationship between coach and client. And why is that? We'd say it's because you're helping someone else grow by reducing their blind spot. Blind spot being some area in which they tend to think they're strong and other people know that they're not strong. And so they don't have the awareness to really grow in that area. It shows that you're invested in their development and are showing them new skills for positive change. So you need trust to be able to successfully deliver hard feedback. And the practice of delivering hard feedback the right way will result in even more trust, so it eventually is no longer as hard. Okay, so this matrix shows all the combinations of what I could know about myself and what others know about me. So if I know that I'm challenged in a particular area and others know, that's a challenge that's in full awareness. I know, everyone else knows, we're working on this together. If I don't know that I'm challenged in a particular area, but others know, that's a classic blind spot. I might think that I'm really empathic and a really great listener, but actually my team might think that I'm anything but. And the disparity between what I know about myself and what others know about me, it forms a little bubble around this area where I really need to grow, but I don't know that I need to grow. And that's really where coaching and negative feedback, when done correctly, can help people grow. Now, if I know that I'm challenged in a particular area and others don't know, you can still work with that. I know that it's a challenge. I just can't really enlist others without making some sort of disclosure or enlisting them directly in that help. But if I don't know that I'm challenged in a particular area and others don't know, then it's unknown to me and it's unknown to them. And again, here there's an area where I just can't grow because I don't have the insight and other people can't give me that insight. So when we talk about cultivating a healthy feedback culture, there are a few basic points here that we want to hit, and there are a few things we need to be able to do. And we'll talk about each of them in turn, but just briefly, you need to be able to be attuned. You want to speak directly to the person. You want to use what are called I messages. It's also important to avoid hyperbolic language. You want to define the problem and the solution, and you want to talk about their behavior, not their attitude. So what do I mean by these things? So it's important to be attuned, really precisely as you can, attuned to what the other person is feeling and experiencing as you're delivering the feedback and as you guys are in an interaction. So you want to pay attention to what is said and what is not said. You want to pay attention to the tone of voice and the nonverbal cues. What subtle facial expressions are they making, and what window might this give you into their inner experience? So you want to try to imagine that what the recipient is feeling as you give the feedback. And then you can test your interpretation, because you're going to have some sense of how it's landing with them. And then you might say, I imagine it might be difficult for you to hear this feedback. That's your guess or your estimation of what they're experiencing during a difficult conversation. And when you say that, it gives the recipient a chance to confirm your interpretation or change it. Either way, it doesn't matter. Either way, that builds your capacity for empathy, because you're increasing your ability to anticipate and interpret another person's internal experience, which is a foundational skill. Now, if you're not attuned and you're totally disconnected from how the other person is reading and experiencing this feedback, you're likely to make a big misstep, and that's going to cause damage and make the relationship more tense and more frayed, and then it'll be something you'll need to repair subsequently. So attunement is key. You also want to speak directly to the person. And that sounds so obvious as to not even be stated, but really what you want to avoid here is triangulation, which is talking to someone that you should talk to directly about hard feedback, and instead talking to a third person with the hope that that third person will communicate to the person you actually need to give that feedback to. So that kind of triangulation is dangerous and typically not helpful, because something is typically lost in translation between what you said to the third party and what the third party has said to the person that you should speak directly to. And it also causes the recipient of the feedback, which is getting it through this third party, to wonder about your intentions and about it gives them a lot of room to speculate about really what's happening here. And by addressing them directly, you can cut through a lot of that. So it's also important to use what are called I messages, which is a statement that focuses on one's feelings or beliefs rather than an attribute of the listener or a perceived attribute of the listener. So an example would be, I felt really frustrated when you sent me your report 3 weeks late. That's an I message. I didn't say, your reports are always late, or you're never getting to me what I need you to get to me. Those are statements about another person, which have problems that we'll get into. I'm just reflecting on how some precisely identified behavior affected me personally. So by framing it in personal terms, you show a little vulnerability, and you stay away from making interpretations about someone else's behavior. And those interpretations tend to be negative and global. And once they're negative and global, then all of a sudden you guys are arguing about the interpretation, not the substance of what the statement was meant to convey. Okay. So in cultivating a healthy feedback culture, it's also really important to use non-hyperbolic language. So you want to stay away from terms like always, never, and even overly positive terms like amazing. Particularly in interactions where you're feeling frustrated. Because the more frustrated you're feeling, or the more anxious you're feeling, the more those hyperbolic statements will feel true. It'll feel true like someone never gets you what they need to get you on time. But if you step back for a moment and really look specifically at instances of that, it's probably not the case that something is never true or it's always true. And what hyperbole does is it causes the recipient to argue about the validity of your hyperbole rather than the substance of your argument. They're likely to respond by saying, I'm not never late. I was on time, 2, 3, 4 other times. And that has just diverted the conversation away from the substance of your argument, which is a concern about their attendance, let's say, and instead it becomes a finer point, a smaller argument about the validity of the hyperbole itself. And once the conversation leaves the domain of your basic concern and goes into the domain of a very specific semantic point about like how late someone was, you're no longer being heard. You're not getting your point across. So you want to try to avoid hyperbolic language. So you want to talk also about the behavior and not the attitude. So saying you are unreliable is an interpretation, and interpretations are always subject to debate. And debate is not what you want to get into in a hard conversation, because you're debating validity, because when you're debating the validity of your argument, the substance of your argument is lost. It's similar to the earlier point. You want to stay away from interpretations, and you want to identify specific behaviors. You also want to define the problem and the solution. So if you can identify a specific problematic behavior, the next step is to clearly identify an alternate behavior that would be a solution. So if the problematic behavior is arriving late to team meetings, a solution might be to send a text message if you're running late. A specific problem and a specific solution. So we've been talking about the mechanics of healthy feedback in terms of what you should say and how you should say it. But let's take a step back for a moment and look at what makes it hard to do that. And part of what makes healthy feedback so hard to give and unhealthy feedback so easy to give, especially when we're stressed, are our natural psychological defenses. So as human beings, we're really hardwired to maintain and enhance our self-esteem. We will naturally attend to information that makes us feel good about ourselves. And our defenses become activated when information threatens our self-esteem. And hard feedback qualifies as a threat to our self-esteem because that feedback really calls into question our value as employees, as workers, and also more deeply as people. So what defenses do is they try to insulate us from threats to our self-esteem. And in fact, what we want to do is learn to tolerate that threat and have a non-defensive conversation, even when we're feeling threatened. So there are four main ways of defensively responding to threats to our self-esteem. And the great psychologist John Gottman calls them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The first is criticism. Now, criticism is a verbal or written attack on someone's personality or character. And when we criticize, what we imply is that the person we're criticizing is fundamentally defective in some way, which is what makes criticism so powerful to give and so damaging to receive. An example might be something like saying, you're way too disorganized to do this job. There you're making an interpretation about someone's fundamental personality from a pattern of behavior. Instead, what you want to do is simply identify the pattern of behavior. So you could say, you've missed your last 3 deadlines without giving any warning of a problem, and I'm concerned that this job isn't a good fit for you, or something like that. You want to precisely identify the pattern of behavior, rather than using criticism to really wield the problematic behavior against the recipient. The next is contempt. And contempt is essentially diminishing someone else in order to portray yourself as superior in some way. This can be through cynicism or making fun, which can seem lighthearted, but isn't necessarily, through mockery, and is often conveyed through tone of voice or nonverbal cues. So if one of my team members comes to me with a new idea for a project and I say, no, we definitely don't want to do that for reasons X, Y, and Z. Just through my tone, I'm saying, your idea is really bad, and I'm implying that no smart person would have that kind of idea. So instead, I might say, that's an interesting idea. How would we respond if X, Y, or Z happened? Which is expressing openness and curiosity about the idea, but then also asking how the person who's giving me the idea might address a couple of different problems, which I could otherwise, if I were going to use contempt, I could use those shortcomings of the idea to really take the person down a notch and make them feel bad. Stonewalling is withdrawing from a difficult conversation so the person you're talking to just can't get through. it usually happens when the person doing the stonewalling is so frustrated and they're too overwhelmed to continue participating in the conversation. They're probably not actually going to stick their fingers in their ears and say blah, 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 blah. But it can be subtle. So when this happens, you can say something like, let's come back to this later with a fresh perspective. Or it can also be subtle and barely noticeable. You may want to check in if you feel like there might be some stonewalling happening, but it's not really over. You can say, are you still with me? Or just want to make sure we're on the same page. What did you hear me just say? When you do that, you're giving the person who you think might be stonewalling you, and they're doing that because they're overwhelmed, the opportunity to come back into the relationship with you and center themselves and try to give you back their understanding of what you just said, which might be really distorted, right? And if there is a distortion, you can correct that. You can address that in the conversation rather than continuing the pattern of stonewalling, which really just causes one person to get frustrated because they're not being heard, and the person who's stonewalling to just feel more and more overwhelmed and unable to deal. So defensiveness is the last category. And it's confusing because it shares the name of a category of defensive behavior, so it's not a great name. But it's essentially failing to take responsibility for your role in a difficult situation and instead placing blame elsewhere, toward the person you're in conflict with, or a third party, or on a set of circumstances that were beyond your control, or anywhere but on your own shoulders. And what you want to do instead of being defensive is to try to identify your role in the conflict and take responsibility for it. That's really hard to do because people often feel like, well, if I admit to the fact that I could have done this better or I did this wrong, whoever I'm talking to is just going to use that against me. And my honest and vulnerable admission of how I could have done things better will just be will be magnified and compounded. And so instead what I should do is be defensive. And in fact, that's not the case. What you want to do is really try to own your part of the disagreement. And that tends to be quite relieving for the other person and tends to help them feel like, okay, I'm in a relationship with someone who can be accountable. I don't need to bear down on them. It's hard. So defenses can be subtle, and everyone has one they tend to rely on. I worry sometimes when I give presentations like this that people think, oh, I don't criticize, I'm not contemptuous, I don't stonewall. And actually, they're really subtle. It would be odd. I want to say I've never come across a human being who didn't have defenses of some kind and didn't use them when they felt threatened. And that goes for me too. And listen, I'm a licensed psychologist. I study this stuff. I've been a therapist to individuals and groups and couples. I've been a client in my own psychotherapy. My wife and I started our relationship in couples therapy. We started our relationship, and very quickly I was going to be moving to another city much faster than would be normal for a couple who's just kind of getting to know each other. So we decided to go to couples therapy to really figure out how we could argue productively. Learned a lot from it, right? We got a lot better from that. But it doesn't matter. I still have defenses that show up when I feel threatened. And so I want to portray this as a natural phenomenon that everyone needs to do work on. So we've been talking about the challenge of creating a healthy feedback culture, and that's usually understood to be a tactical challenge. And by tactical, I mean a challenge that is addressed by policies and procedures like having an annual or biannual or quarterly review process where feedback is collected and you sit down with your manager to go over it. And that is important. Those are important procedural steps. But the real challenge here is psychological, and it has to do with defenses that arise, often automatically, when one's ego is threatened by anticipating having to give negative feedback or anticipating receiving it, or in the actual receiving of the feedback, or after receiving the feedback when you're going over it in your mind. These are all points when defenses can arise because it's so threatening and so challenging to take in difficult information like that. So there's a few key points to take away from this talk. The first is that teaching feedback skills to management can help build trust and improve relationships with all employees. And so, again, the specific skills you want to focus on are to be attuned, speak directly to the person. You want to stay away from triangulation. Use I statements rather than talking about the other person and their behavior and making interpretations. You want to avoid hyperbole. You want to define the problem and the solution, and you want to address the problematic behavior, not the attitude, because your attitude is an interpretation. And then you'll be arguing with the person about the validity of your interpretation, not the underlying concern. Number two, managers struggle to give hard feedback because of their own experiences of fear and conflict. So everybody wants to be liked, and hard feedback makes it hard to feel like you're going to come out of that experience being liked. It's natural, it makes sense. But if you get good at it, actually you'll be, if not liked more, respected more, and that's actually the foundation for a solid relationship with coworkers that you're going for. Number three, fear of delivering hard feedback can lead to bad feedback, which can be damaging. So again, fears are threats to the ego and lead to bad feedback, which is given with contempt or criticism or hyperbolic language, etc. And that's what you want to avoid. Number four, by reducing blind spots, managers can better communicate with and build relationships with their direct reports. So here, self-awareness is key. You can't have a leader in one circle, their team in another, and no overlap between the two. You want a Venn diagram between the two. You want a shared region where both parties can really understand and align around a problem. Number five, coaching can be a powerful tool building confidence and having productive, hard conversations. So you can't know what you don't know, and a coach can help you build that awareness and change your behavior accordingly. So just a note about Torch, giving hard feedback is a common struggle for new and existing managers. It really doesn't matter what level of the organization, especially at fast-growing companies. Torch provides support by pairing managers with coaches and software that also helps the coaches get great insight, coaches and their clients really, get great insight into where they're strong and where they're not so strong, identify a developmental plan that's going to help the client grow over time with the help of feedback from their colleagues, which we believe is really central to growing over time. So we're a very feedback-intensive company, and we really see the value of that for the work that we do. So creating a feedback culture really starts with you and requires everyone in the organization to pivot themselves away from their defenses and toward a sense of openness and curiosity about the feedback, regardless of its content. And I think we have at least a few minutes left for questions.
All right, Keegan, thanks so much for the presentation today. And yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left or so I think we've got plenty of time to get to some questions from folks online. So first question we are going to take comes from Mark. He says that he appreciates the terms negative or hard feedback. However, that classic phrase constructive criticism or feedback sets a more positive tone. So Keegan, what are your thoughts on the choice of words when you approach a situation?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Constructive feedback is a great way to say it. We will tend to use the term negative or hard feedback just to acknowledge the challenge of the situation. There's a way in which constructive feedback, which while it does capture the essence of what you're trying to do, when I hear it used in organizations, there's a way that it can be used euphemistically. And so in order to stay away from that, we tend to use the terms hard feedback or challenging feedback or difficult feedback just to be more precise in terms of what we're talking about. But it's a point well taken.
All right, yeah, great point. Thanks for clarifying that. Next question that we have comes from Angel. Angel says trust is an integral component. So how do you suggest that employees build trust with their supervisors and managers?
Right. Great question. So building trust is all about creating an authentic relationship. And part of that is getting to know the human being that is opposite you, whether they're your manager or they're your direct report. And so in order to create a trusting relationship, it really helps to develop a relationship first and foremost, to know each other to some extent outside of the bounds of all of the we need to get this done, we need to get that done, we have this deadline and we have that deadline, and to really just be able to relate as a human being. So that could be as simple as a lunch or a coffee where you talk about you depart slightly, not drastically, but slightly from the constraints of the normal workplace conversation, and you be a little bit more vulnerable than you would typically be. You might offer something that you're struggling with in your life, again, without being too private, because certainly that would typically not be appropriate. But you give enough, you show enough of yourself that the other person can start to see their own challenges reflected in your life, their own, can start to build a bridge between you and them in terms of, hey, here's a human being who's trying to do the best they can, and that's a challenge for them. Hey, that's something I can really relate to. You've got to find a way to build an authentic bridge between two people, and that will also really help with trust, right? Part of trust is also learn to be accountable and to do a really good job at work so that the person can come to trust you, right? And so in order to do that, it's really helpful to again, be able to talk about your challenges in an open, honest, authentic way, even if you think that your manager won't be able to be supportive in that way. Just by offering that, you're signaling to the other person that you have the character strength and the integrity and the ego strength to be authentic and to be real about who you are and where you are in your career and in your development. And there's a way that does create trust. Now, of course, that requires reciprocation from the other person to be able to metabolize that and to be able to work with it. And in the event that that's not the case, you typically do want to stay away from being more vulnerable, and instead you want to really focus on being known as the person who can deliver what they say they're going to deliver.
A great explanation there, Keegan. Thanks so much. So piggybacking on that first question that we had about hard feedback versus constructive criticism and the different tones those terms set, how can you encourage supervisors to use hard feedback and use it fearlessly? This question comes from Heidi.
Right. So I think it's good to weave it into the whatever kind of performance review plan you've set for yourself. So if you have an annual review plan, what you want to stay away from is just giving hard feedback in the meeting that comes out of that annual review process. And instead, what you want to do is create regular intervals where managers will be given some training on how to do this well and then expected to do it. And then be very vocal about the fact that this is going to be a new initiative that you're going to start, which is based on feedback, and that's really going to privilege the idea that you really need to be, in order to grow as an individual at any organization, you need to get this feedback. So you want to set a regular cadence. It could be monthly, it could be biweekly, across teams within an organization, so that managers get the practice doing it and team members get the practice receiving it. And then if you can also build in regular opportunities for direct reports to give their managers feedback and then give managers support to metabolize that, then it can become slowly over time an integral part of what happens. Organizations tend not to want to do that because it is so hard to do well, and they're worried about big ruptures happening. But if you can make it a systematized, conscious effort that is implemented consistently, not just at the end of the year, but on a regular basis with the right training, then it can really start to cause some big shifts.
Yeah, good stuff. Great advice there. And I also think that when we start to implement feedback in organizations, there's going to be positive, there's going to be negative. That's just the inevitable. And so when you are working toward those shifts, this next question comes from Dina, and it shares an implication that I'm sure a lot of other people feel. So if managers tend to only give positive feedback and state that there's nothing negative to address, which would imply that the manager doesn't take feedback well, how can Dina and other people who feel like Dina provide feedback to this manager in a positive way?
So if you want to give some negative feedback and you're only getting positive feedback, you might say like, hey, I really appreciate all the positive feedback. It's really a validation of the hard work I've been putting in. And at the same time, I feel like I'm there are areas in which I could grow. And I wonder, is there any negative feedback you manager have for me, direct report? And really open that door to receiving some negative feedback, or challenging feedback or constructive feedback. And to the extent that you do that, it's really a signal to the other person that, hey, negative feedback can be a part of this conversation. And then as you become more sophisticated in your ability to tease out that challenging feedback for yourself, it does create a kind of implied permission for you to give that feedback back in a thoughtful way, right? So you wouldn't want to just drop it in the manager's lap. You might start by saying, hey, that was really helpful. I think I can grow a lot from what you said. I wonder if I might also give you some feedback that would help me get more support from you, or that would strengthen our relationship, or that would help to create a more robust working relationship between us, or something to that effect. But it's always good to lead with a little vulnerability on your part, and inviting challenging feedback is one way to do that.
All right, thanks a lot, Keegan. We'll keep going. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. So let's take a question from RJ. And he wants to know if you've encountered major deviation cross-generationally or even cross-functionally via your psychometric data experiences. And beyond the Gen template, what are some significant observations per such that you've made?
Okay, so you're asking about, RJ, it sounds like generational differences in the generosity gap that I discussed earlier, or more broadly speaking across the data. To some extent, yes. So folks who are of a different generation, who are in their 50s and beyond, tend to be a little bit less open to the kinds of relational vulnerability, I guess I would say, that we've found to be really helpful, because they just didn't come from a world where that was ever sanctioned or appreciated. If you came up through the workforce in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, there just wasn't a space for that to take place. It was much more of a command center kind of top-down sort of structure, and you were perceived as weak to the extent that you said things like, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you did X, or hey, would you mind helping me with Y? Like any kind of attempt to get more resources or adjust a relationship to make it more workable for you was seen as a nuisance or a sign of weakness. And so when you move down into Gen X and into the millennial generation, and certainly with people younger than that, you see a much greater openness to this kind of way of relating. And millennials make up, I think, now over half of the workforce. Even as they're aging into an age cohort where you'd find a little bit more of a traditional approach, or a little bit less curiosity about that, and a more traditional way of doing things, we're finding that they're still maintaining that. So I think there is a real generational shift afoot here. But the comment that I think is implied in RJ's question is also accurate, which is that people who came through the workforce earlier just had a very different experience, and it's a bigger shift for them to start to relate in these ways.
All right, awesome, Keegan. Thanks so much. Great point to end on there. We did have plenty more questions coming. I think that they could probably take us to another hour at least. So, folks, if we did not get to your questions today, we'll be sure and pass those on to Keegan so that you are answered and handled at a later time. So just quick reminder to everyone, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Give us about 24 hours and then head on over to your My HCI profile to check out those credit codes. One more big thank you to Keegan and everyone at Torch for helping out in today's webcast, and for all of us here at HCI, thanks for being here.